Welcome everyone to the Yosan University podcast. I have a really interesting guest with me today. And would you like to tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Okay, I'm Zev Rosenberg, at least the last time I checked, in this incarnation. And
Right.
I've been a practitioner of Chinese medicine for the last 43 years. Before that, I was a macrobiotic counselor and shiatsu therapist for several years. And I got naturopathic and Chinese medicine degrees in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at two different schools back in the late 1970s around and to early 1980s. So
That's awesome.
my interest goes back to my teens during the whole 60s explosion. And as Bob Dylan once said, the 60s weren't about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, of course, that was one aspect of it, but really was about an interfacing of cultures that didn't mix with each other before. So
I love
Americans,
that.
idealistic Americans were exposed to the East, and of course in England and Europe as well. When George Harrison picked up his first sitar, and when you started to see philosophical lyrics appearing in Beatles songs and bands like Incredible String Band, Pink Floyd, so forth, it opened up a whole new realm. So that realm opened up for me very specifically. When I was 15 years old, I was listening to already the great psychedelic music of the era: Beatles, Pink Floyd, Bob Dylan. It was like a real Renaissance explosion of music and culture. And Pink Floyd had a song. I happened to go to the public library when I was in junior high school, called middle school today. And I took out a copy of the quote unquote I Ching, the Wilhelm Baines version. And I started pouring through it. And, I was very interested in all these mystical subjects. And I got this first Pink Floyd record with Syd Barrett. And there was a song on it called Chapter 24. And it goes, "A movement is accomplished in 6 stages, and the 7th brings return." I said, wow, this is really a beautiful song. And I just had an intuition, a hunch. I opened up the I Ching, and he had just taken the words verbatim out of it. I said, that is really amazing and far out. So I just kept studying it. And soon after that, we would go, my friends and I in high school would go into New York City, into Manhattan, for concerts at the Fillmore East. And we always were trying different restaurants in the area. And there were a lot of ethnic restaurants, but we discovered a macrobiotic restaurant there. And I picked up a couple of books. One was Zen Macrobiotic Cooking by Michelle Abacera, and one called You Are All Sanpaku, which means 3 whites, whites under the eyes, which means you weren't healthy. And it introduced me to the work of George Osawa, who developed a dietary practice based on yin-yang theory. And he discusses the wuxing, the 5 phases, and applies it to dietetics. And I started following that way of eating immediately. The only problem is there was only 1 or 2 stores in all of New York where you could buy the food. And there was no organic certification in America. So the organically certified products had to be imported from Europe. It was really something. Wow. So I used to take these huge shopping bags home on the train back home. And I had a wonderful mother, so she would cook the food for me. And, the rest is history in that sense. And then I went 2 years to New York University, and then decided to leave for health reasons because New York was not a healthy environment growing up as a kid. I had a lot of respiratory issues, colds, bronchitis constantly every winter, and the air was very polluted. It was long before the Environmental Protection Agency or any idea of environmentalism existed. Mm-hmm. So I moved out to Colorado and got into the natural food business for a few years. And I wasn't very good at it, but there's a magazine out called New York Magazine. The cover article is about Erewhon, which was like the first real natural food store based in Boston, and then they opened a branch in Los Angeles. And I knew the proprietors of both and worked for one in Boston for a while. And this article is really great because it's really the history. Now they have 10 Erewhon stores in Los Angeles. but it goes all the way back, really 50 years. So that was like the
Yeah.
beginning, long before Whole Foods and everything else existed. And so I kind of gave up retailing and wholesaling natural food and decided I wanted a direct relationship with people in the realm of health. So I moved down to Santa Fe, New Mexico in the early 70s, which was a real hotbed for alternative medicine and alternative ideas in general. And first I went to a naturopathic school. And then a couple of years later, I went to a Chinese medicine school and got my license in New Mexico in 1983. But my then partner didn't want to stay there, so we moved back to Colorado, where there was no licensing. And I
Mm.
opened an office a few blocks from the state capitol. And as I practiced undercover, so to speak, underground, started lobbying for a state law. There were 30 of us in the entire state, and half of those people were part-time physicians working in emergency rooms. There was really just a handful of us practicing in those days. How it began, and I just had a tremendous interest in Eastern philosophy going all the way back.
That's
Lao Tzu,
awesome.
Chuang-Tzu. When I was in New Mexico in the 70s, I had a friend there who introduced me to tea, real tea, and copies, beautiful small press copies of Sun Tzu's Art of War and Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching. So I already had those back in the 70s. And then as things began to come out in the medicine realm, I started to get those as well. So that's kind of like my genesis in all this. So you could take it from there as far as anything else.
What was it like studying um, the medicine in the because some of the first schools, the textbooks, there were not as many. There was not as much material. What was it like studying?
Statement. Well, there was one. There was one textbook we had. This was what became later Southwest Acupuncture College, and the owners were in the same class of Southwest Acupuncture. It was a school called the Institute of Traditional Medicine, which I thought was a great name. It had an Ayurvedic school, so I got to study a little bit with Dr. Vasant Lad, the great Ayurvedic doctor, as well.
That's awesome.
It had a Chinese medicine school, and it had a naturopathic school under one roof. But it was actually very, very good. There's another story behind that. I wanted to go to Chinese medicine or acupuncture school earlier, and there was a direct student of George Asawa, the macrobiotic leader in Santa Fe, by the name of Sensei Masahiro Nakazono. I actually got my start through the efforts of a couple of people. The first was a macrobiotic teacher by the name of Noboru Muramoto, and he wrote a book, one of the first books on Asian medicine in the English language in 1973. It was called Healing Ourselves. And what was
Mm.
different about this book, it wasn't just yin yang and diet. It also talked about the Shang Han Lun, which is, wow,
Okay.
3
Yeah.
yang
Yeah.
and yin. He also talked about herbal medicine, and he sold Chinese herbs. And I started buying Chinese herbs from him in the early 70s. And he did acupuncture. So I'd invited him to Santa Fe to give a seminar at a little restaurant called the Happy Carrot. And
That's an awesome name.
yeah, it was like a vegetarian restaurant, really good one, by the way. And he gave me my first acupuncture treat with gold needles, all back shoe points. And I remember trying to sit back in my car afterwards, and like my back would go, "Spring, did he leave the needles in? Check, check, check." There were no needles in my back. It just, having never had acupuncture before, I could feel them. But he told me, if you really want to understand macrobiotics, you must study the Shang Han Lun. He told me back in the 70s, this, right?
Mm-hmm.
It stuck with me. And I said, this is the model I want. I don't want to just teach macrobiotic diet. I also want to do acupuncture and herbs. So there was this other Japanese teacher in Santa Fe who was a renegade from George Asawa. And it turns out he was correct. He said that George Asawa misinterpreted yin and yang for Westerners.
Hmm.
And that's a long story explaining what. But I actually answered this on Facebook the other day. Well, George Asawa apparently felt, this is just after World War II, after the defeat of Japan, that Westerners were too materialistic to understand a yin-yang with yang, heaven, yin, earth. So he switched it around, that earth was yang and heaven was yin.
Really
Yes.
interesting.
But he didn't change anything else. Like, for example, women were considered to be more yin, men more yang, nighttime more yin, daytime more yang, cold more yin, heat more yang, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of jumbled everything up and
Oh
created some
wow.
confusion. So Sensei Nakazono, he's also studied Sensei Yeshiva Aikido, and George Asao had sent him to India. And while he was in India, he found that the macrobiotic diet didn't work there as taught by Asawa. He started adding more local foodstuffs and so forth, and was able to establish health by adopting, of course, to the climatary uh,
Hmm.
practices diet there, and which is, of course, what macrobiotics is supposed to do. You're supposed to adapt it to the environment and the local regimens wherever you live. So he invited me to sit in one of his classes, and I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again here because it's really worthwhile. So it was in a dojo. It was Adobe Dojo down by the Santa Fe River, and you had to sit in seiza position on a cushion, sitting on your legs, and everybody's sitting on the floor. And he comes in, he's holding a newspaper article. Very interesting. Japanese scientists find 4 types of blood tissue. This is interesting, but what's wrong with his discovery? So all the students are sitting there in total silence, afraid to answer his question. I'd read one of his books, and I understand his whole system was based on the whooshing, the 5 phases as applies to sound, like the
Mm.
vowels, e, o, u. It
Yeah.
was sound-based teaching. And there was a transcendent dimension that they call it E, or the letter I, pronounced E, was the transcendent dimension. So I raised my eyes. I knew what he was looking for. I said there should be 5 types of blood tissue. He's missing the E dimension. So I thought he was going to say, "Wow, you'll be a great student. You should come to my school." That's not what happened. He screamed at his other students for making him look bad. I said, "You have made this old man lose face," and he stormed out of the school and didn't come back for 2 weeks.
What?
Yeah, so I got a rejection notice instead of an acceptance notice.
Oh no.
So he rejected me as a student. I guess he thought I was too uppity, but I was innocent. I didn't know it. I just was trying to answer his question. Well, anyway, another acupuncturist, this hippie guy, came down from Vancouver named Stuart Watts in a VW van with a bunch of students in tow. He was teaching up in Vancouver, BC, and he came down to Santa Fe and opened a school with a local owner of a dojo who was also an acupuncturist, Michael Moore, and his name was Stuart Watts. He was related to Alan Watts, the famous
Wow.
Zen teacher, and I think that was like his cousin or something, or uncle. I don't remember now, and our guest. So he opened a school there, and of course, Mr. Nakazono and his students were very upset about it. So I went there, right,
That's
at
wild.
the Institute of Traditional Medicine. I ended up there, and one of our guest teachers was Ted Kapchuk, and he
Yeah.
would fly in and teach sometimes. And so we had one textbook, which was from mainland China, which was the forerunner of what they call today CMX, or Chinese Moxibus and Acupuncture. It was then called The Outline of Chinese Acupuncture. And it was a horrible book, and I knew it. And it was designed for like a short course for MDs who came to China. All the point indications were oversimplified. I mean, the basic information was there, but it was basically poorly translated and, in my opinion, very useless. But that was the state board book back then. So I refused to use it. So Eastland Press, Dan Bensky and John O'Connor's company, came out with their very first publication, which was a translation of what was called the Shanghai Test, a comprehensive text of acupuncture and
Hmm.
moxibustion. So I ignored the other book and studied that book, and of course, not only passed everything, but went beyond the knowledge base that was in. And there were a lot of quotes from older texts and classics. And then I also ordered books from Henry C. Liu in Vancouver, BC, and it had the original Chinese text and a pretty bad translation of it. But at least we had those.
That's
And
awesome.
the other textbook was Ted Kapchuk's book, The Web That Has No Weaver. That
There you
was one of
go.
our textbooks. And then finally, there was one herbal book by Hong Yan Shu from the Oriental Healing Arts Institute in Orange County. And it was basically overly biomedicalized, but it was basically a compo text. In other words, based on Japanese herbal medicine with the diagrams, the pictures of the belly and the bad parts and so forth. But the translation, his idea of translating is to biomedicalize everything. So it
Mm,
was it got you the names of the formulas, it got you some basic indications. And then, we were able to get granules. And then there were a couple of other books that came. There was a woman, Kim Chi Young, who put out a good 2-volume set of all of the main Chinese herbal formulas. And then finally, Eastland Press and Bensky published, first Materia Medica and then Formulas and Strategies, which became, of course, the main textbooks and are still used today in updated editions. So
yeah.
that's what we had to go on. And, we had a lot, it was idealism and youth for that generation of practitioners. I mean, look, I was so naive. I just knew this is what I had to do. I wasn't thinking about how do I make a living on it or anything else.
Hmm.
Right? This is just what I wanted to do. And I was so excited by it. So when I went back to Denver, Colorado, and Boulder, within a year, I had 100 patients a week. There was such a demand for it by word of mouth.
That's awesome.
And I was getting all kinds of conditions. So, you just had to keep studying and studying and learning. And it was like, they say, like growing up in public. I really had to grow up in public. But thank God I was able to pull it off. And I had one treatment room grew to 2, grew to 3. Then I took the whole building. It was like a Victorian house and put an herb pharmacy in, got someone to run the pharmacy. All this happened within a couple of years. It
That's awesome.
happened very, very fast. But what happened after 7, 8 years was um, a relationship I was in ended, a marriage I was in ended, and um, also the economy in Colorado tanked because they were relying too much on fossil fuel extraction, and there was
Mm,
a bust. And it was time for a change because I was exhausted from seeing so many patients. So
I'm sure.
I decided to take a year sabbatical. So I went back to New Mexico and taught at the school there, and also worked on getting my license in California. So I had to take some additional courses. In those days, they had no license reciprocity. There was no national licensing exam that time. In fact, I took the first national licensing exam in the late '80s in San Francisco, and so I had to get a degree from Emperor's College in Los Angeles. Yosan, by the way, it had already existed. I think they already had just started back in the '80s. So I knew of
That's
it,
awesome.
but I had some connections at Emperor's around the corner, literally. So I took some courses there.
Well, my next question is this, because you started out as a practitioner, but then you moved into education, and
Right.
also, and this my question is because I have known of you through education and also through the books that you've written,
Mhm.
and what sparked this interest in writing and in sharing this knowledge that you had gained? What was it, the catalyst that kickstarted your desire to write?
By the way, what I'm doing here is I'm eating a formula by my friend Justin Penoyer called Dinger One,
Nice.
Settle the Will Pill. So I'm taking it because it's nighttime here.
That's awesome.
So what got me into that? We have a proverb in Judaism: if you know Aleph, you should teach Aleph, and you learn by teaching. I really got into
I love
teaching in
that.
order to learn more. You know,
I
and
love that.
also it forced me just like my practice forced me to keep studying and learning and growing and finding different teachers and picking up from them. Teaching also forced me to do that, and I made some pretty embarrassing mistakes in my first years of teaching. Because my Chinese skills weren't there. So um, and we used to have a joke I had with my old friend Chip Chase, who passed away some years ago, and a few others. So we all graduated from MSU, making stuff up. If someone asked you a question you couldn't answer, I mean, sometimes I'd be honest and say, I don't know, but sometimes you thought you knew from your own intuition what the answer would be. And sometimes, unfortunately, your intuition can be very good and correct, but other times, it's wrong. So,
Yeah.
but you just have to keep checking yourself and updating your knowledge. So,
Yeah.
but we certainly
What
had
was
the
your
inspiration and enthusiasm back then.
right? What was your first book that you wrote? What inspired that?
I actually wrote a lot of articles over the years that were published in different journals, like the CJOM, the journal here, and the JCM in London, and it just shut down the Lantern in Australia. So I just wrote a lot of articles because I was teaching full time
Yeah.
for 23 years. 22
Yeah.
of those years as a department chair at Pacific College at PCOM, right? So it was very hard to write a book after teaching so much.
Yeah.
I think I overdid it even though I had cut my practice back by half, teaching 2 or 3 nights a week. I burnt myself out. I got a really bad flu. I mean, it's as bad as anything I can imagine COVID would feel like. I was very
Yeah.
fortunate. We had a mild case of COVID, but man, did I get slammed. I was down for 6 weeks. So I cut back my teaching schedule at that time a bit, and also cut my practice back a bit too at that time. And that was like 23 years ago. So
Yeah.
I learned to take better care of myself. I had young kids, and I had too many responsibilities, aging in-laws, and all that kind of stuff going on. But so what were you asking about teaching? There,
I just was interested in some of the books that you'd written.
Oh yeah, you guys were talking about all the articles that I had written, and I was also doing a lot of seminars in different places. So about 10 years ago, I think I had enough of master's education. Let's put it that way. The
Yeah.
schools had changed. It became much more of a large financial enterprise. The tuitions went way up, and it was a different generation of students. Don't get me wrong. I mean, still had some great students all the way to the end of my master's teaching career. But there was more entitlement, and too many people just wanted to pass exams and get their license. And you
Mm.
were just there to give them the information they wanted and shut up about anything else. You weren't supposed to challenge the students. You weren't supposed to, you know what I mean? It just
Yeah.
changed. Just there's different generations, and different generations have different media and different influences and different cultural aspects to them. So it got to a point where I needed another way to communicate the medicine than that.
Mm.
And I was used for many years to being my own boss, really. I mean, in Pacific College, but as it got bigger and bigger, it became much more regimented, and my opinions weren't listened to as much. And again, I'm not really blaming the institution as much as it was just a global change in the profession and teaching in
Yeah.
general, certifications, licensure, everything like that. Most of the schools, I think, had that problem. So I don't want to single out Pacific College for that, because I'm still very grateful for all the time I spent there. But it was time for something else. So once that was done, I had all these notebooks that I had filled up with ideas and little things, jotted down stuff. And one of the former students there, she was like very good at editing, very smart. She had an advanced English degree. I gave her this stack of books, of notebooks. I have huge piles of them here, including pulse records and things like that, because I always do the pulse by hand. That's a whole other topic. I always draw pictures of the pulses and the tongues.
That's awesome.
And she would mark page after page with those little sticky things. This looks good, try that. And out of that, I was able to put together stuff towards a first book. But first, she couldn't really serve as a full-time editor. She had other things, other fish to fry. So I was asked to teach a 5-day seminar with Lonnie Jarrett in Massachusetts. It must have been like 8 years ago. And there was a young man sitting in the front row, Daniel Schreier, his name was. And he had a big stack of books, all the kind of books I like, Paul Unshold, all the classics. And he had an iPad. I said, "Can I see your iPad?" And it had all these PDFs of all these different Chinese texts and translations and things like that. And I looked at him with him. I had strong intuition. "How would you like to be my editor?" And he said, "Sure, I'd love to be your editor." And he
That's
turned
awesome.
out to be a great editor. So we put the first book together, The Returning to the Source, which was basically advocating that the basis of education should be in the Neijing, in the Suwen, in the Lingshu, in the Nanjing, in the Shang Han Lun as the foundation. And I tried to get a required Shang Han Lun course at UCOM and succeeded, but it took me 5 years of teaching as an elective. And then I also did further training Shang Han Lun Arnold Versluis, who is still teaching today at the ICEM, the International Institute of Canonically Based Medicine, Chinese medicine. And so it was time for me to really hand it over in a different medium, which was the book. So I was able, with Daniel's help, I was able to compile these notes, fill them out, and make the first book. It
That's
actually came
awesome.
together without that much effort, I have to say. So, and then
That's
the
really interesting.
second book came out just as COVID was started, which was unfortunate. And it was a book on my very first translation that I was able to get very close with was the Nàn Jing.
Mm.
And there's a couple of background things behind. One of my original teachers in Chinese medicine, although I never formally studied with him, we were connected over many years, named Michael Brofman, and he has a clinic called the Pine Street Clinic and Pharmacy up in San Anselmo, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I first met him in Boulder, also in the mid 70s, when I was in the natural food business. He used to have people lining up down the block to get treated by him. And the only way you could study in those days, first he got a degree in Chinese language at university, and then
Mm.
he went to Taiwan and apprenticed.
Mm.
His apprenticeship was a very good one. And his teacher relied on the Nan Jing. And so to this day, Michael's medicine is still based largely on that text. And he said that it's like a haiku, it's like condensed Chinese medicine. It's also, if you look at a lot of the Japanese schools of acupuncture and the Worsley school, though they won't admit it, it's really based on ideas from the Nanjing. So
Mm.
so-called five-phase, five-element acupuncture, that's the real source of it, is the Nanjing.
That's awesome.
So another colleague of mine in Colorado had studied in Okinawa. That's where he learned to do acupuncture and herbal medicine. And he had a practice up in the foothills behind Denver named Don Hayes. He's retired now. But his teacher also relied on the Nan Jing as the basis of his
R-
practice.
Really? That's interesting.
And then Paul
Well,
Unshold did the first academic level translation of the Nan Jing in 1987. So I read it over and over and over again, maybe 25 times. And around the late 80s to early 90s, probably late 80s, I finally got to immerse in the Chinese language. Before then, if you want to learn enough Chinese to read Chinese medical texts, you basically had to go immerse yourself in a culture like in Taiwan specifically, because that was the most open place. For most of
mhm.
my earlier years, mainland China was not really open at that point.
Yeah.
It took some time. But thanks to the works of Nigel Wiseman, who wrote the Practical Dictionary of Chinese Medicine, it gave a bridge from English to Pinyin to Chinese. It
Yeah.
also provided working translations and definitions for essential Chinese terms, which no one else had really provided in depth up to that point. It's like if you spoke to a class of students, which I would do and challenge them, What do you mean by what is a channel?
Yeah.
What is Yuan Qi? What is Source Qi? What is Wei Qi? What does that mean? What is Defense Qi? What does that concept mean? People were memorizing information without knowing what it means, and it's useless in that way. So I started requiring all students in my classes, at least, to read as much as possible, if possible, cover to cover of the Practical Dictionary of Chinese Medicine. Nigel, with his collaborations, also after that put out books on learning Chinese language, how to write the characters, how to translate. So I'm very grateful for that work. And that work was published by Paradigm Press, Bob Felt, who was an early pioneer in the medicine as well. So that was a very important stepping stone for me.
There's so many questions, but the first one would be this. One of the things that you briefly mentioned along the way that I'd like to dive into more is how do you manage your own self-care? You talked about balancing it. I've seen you drinking your tea and you taking your herbs, but you had said that you stopped teaching because you felt a bit burned out. What are some of the practices that you bring in for your own self-care?
Well, one of the things I always tried to teach and still do is that it is possible to have longevity in this profession and keep your enthusiasm up. I mean, I still wake up every day grateful and thankful that I'm practicing and doing what I do, and still studying the text. I could see lifetimes of study, and I've been blessed to make some real great connections with people like Sabina Wilms, and who I study with when I can, classical Chinese language and in terms of the classics, and Stephen Cowan, who is done a lot of research into seal script and original characters. So I'm able to really keep my inspiration level up. But I think I've always had self care. I just wrote on my website, zevrosenberg.com, I published a thing on kanji and my own personal health regimen. And I was very hesitant to put it out there because I don't want the places that sell some of these things to sell out.
Yeah.
I use like a special Korean bamboo salt, which is prepared alchemically. Various things like cordyceps and extracts from Dragon Herb Company, uh, like lion's mane and things like that. And so I really laid it all out there, all the different things that I do. And I have a regimen every morning that takes a few hours, which is Qigong, yoga, stationary bike, herbal Dead Sea bath, salt bath, and Jewish prayer and meditation. So, I do have I really feel like a person's spiritual practice and spiritual life is a private concern. I'm not a proselytizer in any sense. But let's say that being in touch with my own spiritual roots and teachings is very important. And the practice of Judaism that I have, which is Sephardic Judaism, um, is one for a better term, is the most Zen style of Judaism there is. In other words, very simple, very direct, without a lot of mumbo jumbo and intermediaries between you and the source of creation. So you have to have spiritual health. And I think it was just a matter I was overworking, had a young family, had bills to pay, and in-laws to help take care of, although my wife did most of that. It was just taking on too much, and also having a big open heart. Sometimes people with open hearts overcommit themselves and overdo and end up hurting themselves in the process. But I think for the last several years, I've pretty much had that under control. Of course, none of us can avoid the sorrows and stresses and things that happen in life. And being a sensitive individual, I think most uh, excellent physicians and healers are empaths. They feel things deeply.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing because you're sensitive, your sense of touch in terms of pulses and hearing the person's voice and listening to their issues is very good. The other side of it, though, is that you're sensitive to noise like lawnmowers and leaf blowers and jets. I grew up in New York next to JFK Airport, and the flight path was right over my house, at least,
Wow.
24 hours a week. and the house would rattle and shake over and over again. I think that kind of oversensitized me in some ways. And also what's going on in the world. We're living in very turbulent times. So it's it takes work to stay centered and focused and not get drained by that as well.
Yeah. My second question would be this. For young people that are getting into this profession, what advice would you give them as they pursue this passion, this career, this journey?
You know, um, I think the educational system needs some reformation. And one of the things I like places like Yosan is that it's largely happening there. Under Rob's direction, was a very mindful man, and of course the Mao Xingnis have always been devoted to classical medicine. But its lifestyle, I think, is the most important thing. Is that you have to live Chinese medicine. You have to be
Yeah.
aware of the seasons. One of the secrets of how acupuncture works, especially, is circadian rhythms, and also the time of day you take herbs or the seasons you take them. All these things are very important. And a lot of what I do in my practice really is working with circadian rhythms and Ministerial Fire, which is, of course, the topic of my latest book, Afterglow. So, just trying to give people the sense of depth and the tools to study on their own, because you don't graduate and stop studying. You're studying the rest of your life. And
Yeah.
also the recognition that the tools that we use, needles, moxas, cups, and to some degree herbal medicine as well, that they're technologies. What makes Chinese
Yeah.
medicine Chinese medicine is the theory and the principle behind it, the philosophy. It's a philosophy, it's a way of life. There was a famous physician in the early 20th century who wrote a book on the combination of Western and Chinese medicine, but with the emphasis on Chinese medicine. And he was a Taoist and meditator and qigong master. But he said that the purpose of using needles, moxas, and herbs is to teach our patients the philosophy of the Nàn. And that's been my motto ever since I read that many years ago. We're teaching philosophy, we're teaching self awareness, and we're awakening people's self healing qualities. So that's what I try to give over to people. We're not technicians. There's a chapter in that first book, Returning to the Source, technician versus scholar physician, where I really lay out what the choice is in terms of your practice. You could be a technician. You could work in, again, I'm not putting this down.
Yeah.
Work in a fertility clinic, a pain clinic. These are all good experiences. But if you stop there, you're going to burn out. You're going to get
Yeah.
bored and you're going to get stuck. When you live the medicine, when you study the philosophy of it, you keep enlightening yourself, you keep growing, you keep finding new areas to expand into, both personally and with your patients. And the practice becomes an interface between you and what we call the patient. And there's an exchange of chi. It's really a wonderful thing. And you make real friends. Like the great Chinese physicians always said that, like Sun Tzu Miao said, that I should treat my patients as if they're my own family. And that
I
requires
love
a
that.
great sense of trust on the patient's part and the practitioner's part. And that's always been my goal. There was a famous homeopath named J.T. Kent who lived in the late 19th century. And he said, I have three circles of patients. The outer circle are people who have some interest and curiosity in it, and they come and go, but they don't have any real interest in, self healing or how the medicine really works. The second level are more serious patients, but it's still somewhat impersonal. But he said, my core patients are like my family and my close friends. And so that's how I kind of see it as well. But I'm at
I
a
love that.
point in my practice after so many years where nearly everybody is like family or close friend to me that I treat.
There was I love that. I absolutely love that. There was a point for myself where you reminded me of something, um, that when I was studying and 2000, before I moved back to Asia, I had gotten really sick. I was working too much, doing graduate school,
Ooh.
studying, and at the same time doing all of these things. And I caught the swine flu that came through LA in 2008, and it went deep. So it went in, and then it affected my heart, and I was getting palpitations and things.
Mhm.
And I recovered, but then I kept getting symptoms, and it kept getting deeper. And one of the interesting things is I went to professors describing symptoms that I was having, describing things that were going on, and people were stumped. And no judgment on anyone, but one of the things that I finally did is I kept looking, and finally, one of my professors, when I would describe what I experienced, he's like, "I don't know, but that sounds like something from the Shang Han Lun," because I used to experience, and I would feel when I would get a symptom, I would feel it along the sanjiao and the gallbladder, and I was like, I feel like there's this hidden pathogen that's half in, half out,
Beautiful.
and
Not
and
beautiful that you had it, but beautiful the way you're describing.
yeah, and it was just I could feel it. I could feel those points, and I was like, that point right there hurts. And they're like, well, that's the gallbladder point, and I was like, well, that makes sense. I feel like there's this thing that's not fully out. And I had to get really sick. And I went to one doctor, and she listened to me. And she said, Sean, I do not understand this, but I will go deep. She dug out her Shang Han Lun, and she says, I'm not going to give you any acupuncture herbs. We're going to use moxa. I'm going to try to build you up and use moxa to strengthen from the inside out and drive out this pathogen. And slowly over time, I got better, and I made a full recovery even after. Like, there was one point where I was in really, really bad shape. I couldn't even walk up a flight of stairs because it felt like my heart was going to explode. But yet it took someone who threw all the books out the window and said, let's go back to source. Let's go back to the classics. Let's go back to that, and dove deep, and was willing to research and to look at things. Now, when I moved back to Asia, one of the things that I noticed was that the symptoms that I would describe, people here would understand.
Oh,
Oh, you have dumya, you have wind illness. Ya, you have wind illness. Okay, yeah, let's pull out the cups, and grandma will start doing cup therapy or gua sha to you, and like it's known, and like one of the most like the superpower of medicines is like tiger balm, any of the hot oils and cupping,
no.
and the majority of the illnesses that people experience here are dealt with that. And
Right.
yet there's also this understanding of diet, and it's just this whole mindset shift that to me I find is so important at bringing into the consciousness. And that's why I feel like after 15 years in Asia, I'm ready to re-engage the medicine, because
Beautiful.
there's just this beautiful level of
You're
understanding.
living in it, you know?
Exactly.
And living in the medicine is living in nature and seeing the shifting of the sun and the moon and the seasons and the time of the month and everything else starts to really influence you in these first subtle but then conscious ways.
Yesterday I was driving in the road, and driving in Ho Chi Minh City traffic is always an
I
adventure,
can imagine.
because it's true yin and yang. So I'm driving down the right side. There's other people coming on the left side, but we also have, so yang and then yin. But there's also yin within yang. There's people coming down the side on this way, going the opposite direction on the outside before they cross to the other side. And then there's people going this way in tandem because they aren't crossing the traffic. And it's
Would make
yang
me
within yin,
nervous.
yin within yang, and then yang changes into yin, yin changes into yang. And I was just, as I'm driving there, for a moment, I was like, there it is. I saw it. And it was like, but it had to be experienced. And I feel like so much of this medicine is experiential. And I think that that's something that the schools don't miss, but that students miss. I think it's there, and I think that people try to instill it, but I feel like people have to be willing to embrace it.
Well, Sabina Wilms and I did 2 workshops out in Taos, New Mexico, because when I was in New Mexico, in my naturopathic school days, but continuing after that, I learned all the local medicines, and mountainous regions have a lot of powerful medicines. And before World War II, that was basically the only medicine for the Hispanic and the Native American populations there. It was a relatively sophisticated herbal approach with hot and cold and different flavors and so forth. So I apprenticed in a little store with a curandera named Senor Lujan, and he taught me all the local herbs and how to make baths out of them and so forth. So what Sabina and I did, we came up with this really ludicrous but really forward-looking project. We were going to find Chinese herbs that grow in the New Mexico Rocky Mountains, and we found 30. And we looked them up in the Bonsao Gongmu, in Li Shizhen's books, and in the Shang Buncao, the Divine Farmers Materia Medica. If not the same, in the same family or close enough to it. We found goji berries growing on, adobe walls and stuff. It was really quite magical, and very potent mints growing in streams, and osha root, which is very similar to a Chinese herb, chuangxiong, same family, ligusticum. It was like a real adventure, and everybody, including myself and Sabina, were transformed by that because you're in nature, looking for medicines, tasting them, feeling their
Yeah.
effects, fresh, then going back to a classroom in a natural setting and studying over good tea, using classical texts. We had like a Paul Unshold primer on different classics, and we would translate them and discuss them, and very dialogue based. And I learned a lot, and the students learned a lot. And I always said that would be an ideal method of education. I then got to also sit in with Dr. Ladd. Dr. Ladd formed his own school called the Ayurvedic Institute in Albuquerque. And I sat on a few classes, and I'm saying, this is really where it's at. It's like students were required there to follow a certain diet, basically vegetarian, eat clean, do yoga, sit on the floor, don't point your feet at the teacher. There was respect. It wasn't like it wasn't like a culty. It was like, just the normal normative behavior in studying in a classical medical institute, whether it was China, Tibet, or India.
Yeah.
I said that kind of atmosphere is so different than what had happened in classrooms in like the typical TCM schools, fluorescent lighting, no
Yeah.
open windows, cramming for exams, people bringing in fast food and the room, dumping in the trash and the whole room smells of that. I mean, I'm not saying, again, I'm not blaming any one school. There were a couple of schools that were like that, though. And the students would be falling asleep, and I would just feel drained trying to
Yeah.
teach under those conditions. I mean, one of the nice things about Zoom is that I don't have to do that classroom thing so much. I mean, I
Right.
still want to do in-person classes, but in nicer settings. So the last time I taught at one school, we rented out a yoga studio with a nicer environment rather than use the regular classrooms in the building where the school was. Not Yosan, a different school. So
Yeah.
I like going to Yosan a lot. So it's right near the beach, and a lot of
Yeah.
natural food restaurants right nearby. My favorite natural food restaurant on the West Coast is right there, called Shojin, and it's
Oh, yeah.
like supreme quality macrobiotic food.
That's awesome.
It's only a few blocks from the campus on Washington Boulevard. So I
That's
always
really cool. I'll have to go check it
used
out
to go
when
there
I'm
and
back.
teach.
What would you say to students that are having? Uh, what are some of the most important principles when a student approaches a patient,
Approaching their patients.
their patients, or a
I'll give a
practitioner?
little story behind that. And this was, you're not there just to give them what they want. In other words, and no, you don't have to be like I ran into an old friend of mine, hiking today in Torrey Pines Beach, and he was saying, "Well, I don't have any patients anymore." And he was, I was saying, "Well, um, you said you had a lot of patients, during and around COVID. Obviously, we all were because everybody was so traumatized by it. And what I would do is I create space just for the body and the mind to reconfigure itself in a safe space environment." He said, "I know, I challenge my patients. I give them a hard time. I said to myself, a little bubble, that's why you don't have patience. It's one thing to challenge, it's another thing to be supportive. However,
Yeah.
being supportive doesn't mean, quote unquote, give them what you want. In other words, oh, get rid of my pain. It's such as what pain is much deeper than a physical pain or symptom.
Yeah.
And it's almost always connected with other things going on. Yes, you could do a sports medicine model, and I highly respect that model. If you set up that place as a pain clinic or a sports medicine clinic, then you can do that kind of orthopedic acupuncture. I'm fine with that, but it's very, very different than what I'm doing and what I suggest that students do. And I'll give you a case of an example that got me in trouble. I was asked to basically teach in a fertility clinic a seminar on herbal medicine and for different conditions and regulating the cycle and fertility, et cetera, et cetera. And so then I did some grand rounds. I went to see some patients. And there was one woman, a woman in her late 40s, thin as a rail, A plus plus personality, deer in the headlights eyes popping out of her head. I looked at her tongue, it was flaming bright red. And the pulse was flooding, large, rapid, and empty. And she was bleeding. And she was there to try to get pregnant. I said, well, how long ago did you have a miscarriage? She just had a miscarriage a couple of weeks before. And she wanted to get pregnant again right away. I said, why? Can you wait 6 months, a year before trying? You need to be built up. Your blood is wasted. You're still bleeding. You're traumatized. How do you expect to get pregnant? No, I have to get pregnant now. I said, why? Because my husband will leave me unless I get pregnant.
Oh.
Number one, she was in her late 40s. Number two, she just had a miscarriage. I remember correctly, she had a few miscarriages. And the practitioner was like, oh, I'm just there basically to support whatever this person wants. Not that it would be so easy to get this person pregnant under those conditions anyway. But, the practitioner was very offended that I had said that to the patient. But I wasn't being challenging or unkind. It was just, what's realistic here? What can you really accomplish? Some people really need time to rebuild their Wei Qi, their defense Qi, their blood, their Jing, whatever it is. It's a construction process. It takes time. You have to work with nature.
Yeah.
Biomedicine's strength and weakness at the same time is that it goes against nature. Like if someone has cystic fibrosis, the only way they'll survive is a lung transplant. But then with that lung transplant, they're going to need immunosuppressive drugs probably for the rest of their life. But if you don't do that surgery, if you don't give them a lung transplant, they'll die. Same with kidney, right? You're literally going against nature. You're extending life by using technology to keep the person going. And as we know in fertility medicine, there's a lot of technology as well. So I feel that people have to be clear, especially if you're working in a place like a pain clinic, a fertility clinic. You don't want to just take away the pain and put the person out into the gym again where they're going to bust their lower back lifting 200-pound weights. Some trainers are just like, viciously insane about pump, 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 pump. Is that what you want to do? You're a technician when you do that. Okay, your pain's gone. Go back to what you're doing. Nothing has really changed. But what we should be saying or helping a patient, maybe there's a better way for you to stay strong and healthy. And also explain to them that those muscles that you have comes from the Jing that was stored in your internal organs. And you're taking that Jing and weakening your internal organs to strengthen your musculature. There has to be a balance between inside and outside, between yin and yang, and express it in an intelligent way. And I find that people always get it when you do it like that. But I think students feel pressured to perform and to get stuff done within like a certain period of time. And that burns people out.
Yeah.
There's people you can help. There's people you can't. There's patients that are suitable for me. There's patients that are suitable for others, so I refer those out. I referred a patient out recently with later stages of severe cirrhosis of the liver. And the wife was, bless her heart, she was very, very insistent that you're the best. You got to treat him. Please, please, please. Meanwhile, he's on one of these medications. He was in and out of the hospital. And normally I don't treat people like that. So he came once. He did all right. Second time she had to cancel, he had to go into the hospital. Third time she had to cancel because he went to the hospital. Fourth time, finally brought him up, came up into my office and almost passed out. He's like 7 feet tall, and I had to stand up to keep him up. And after that, I said, no, I can't do this. I can't treat him. But I did refer him out to someone who was willing to treat him. And apparently he's doing all right, although he stopped going, so I imagine he's very sick. In other words, I learned early on not to be a heroic doctor. You know, a lot of people would come in later stages or last hope type of thinking. And you have to be careful about that as well. So, I mean, I could just go
If you
on
could
and on.
go, no, it's all good. If you could go back and you were getting into this medicine again, starting all over, what would you do differently this time?
Personally, or I would, first of all, if I was like 20 years younger, I would start an all classics school. Make the
Oh yes.
basis of the classes would be Su Wen, Ling Shu, Nan Jing, Shang Han Lun, history of Chinese medicine, basic acupuncture theory. Do a year of acupuncture moxa only, a year of herbal medicine only, and then for the biomedical courses, let them take the biomedical courses at a community college before coming to Chinese medicine school. And then in the third year, taking the Western disease model and working with that in terms of Chinese medicine, translating one system into the other intelligently, and also with exposure to other systems such as Tibetan medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, traditional medicine, Southeast Asia, so people know it's there and that we're not alone. It isn't just Chinese medicine, quote unquote, and its variants in Japan and so forth. That's how I would teach it. And that's how I would like to learn it. But like I said, I've always been an autodidact. I've always trained myself. And, I just basically, within the structure of the school I went to, taught myself the medicine. I used what the teachers knew, but I read my own books. I went to other places and studied with them and put together what eventually became my own way of teaching, so,
I love
and
that.
practicing. So, but
I
not
love that.
everybody can do that. And I'm not patting myself in the back. There's different styles of learning. I happen to be a very visual learner. I love looking at mandalas and charts and putting information into like clouds, so to speak. And that's how I write my books too. I make these charts and I put thoughts in them, and then I pull the thoughts down and write text out of them. That's how I write. So,
That's awesome.
and the fourth book's
We,
in the works now.
fourth book's in the works. When can we be expecting that?
Hopefully within a year or two. It's going a little slower this time, but I'm writing it with Steve Cowan, and it's called A Ring Without End, and it's about how the Chinese discovered a complete circulatory system of blood and fluids and channels, and what channels are, and its connection to natural cycles and circadian rhythms. Fascinating project.
Sounds
And
interesting.
the third book is on ministerial fire. It's called Afterglow, and it's a more very important concept in Chinese medicine that's been left out of most programs. So it's very, very important. But what's living has warmth, and what's dead is cold. Our blood is
Mm,
warm. We're warm blooded creatures. Where does that heat come from? How is that vital heat generated? How do we master it to use it as a friend rather than a foe? And sometimes the ministerial fire is counterintuitive to people who have a Western mindset, which is one of the big problems. You have to retrain the mind into what you discovered living in Asia all these years, that there's a different mindset in Asian culture about how we view health, the body, medicine, diet, living in nature. You have to retrain the mind out of that biomedical mindset into this mindset. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at the tools of needles, herbs, moxas from a biomedical point of view. And it won't work as well, in my opinion, if you do that without this other context. So, inflammation is a prime example. The idea in Western medicine, what do you do with inflammation? You give steroids, which basically put out the fire. But what if the inflammation is the body's ministerial fire trying to expel a cold disease, as in Shang Han Lun, right?
yeah.
Or wind. So you get inflammation of the joints in a condition such as rheumatoid arthritis. Is that heat the disease? Do you want to put out that fire? Or do you help the body expel cold, and that's the body's heat trying to expel the cold. It's a whole other way of looking at that. Now, I'm not saying, mind you, that sometimes you put down the fire. Maybe the fire's too much, right? But we need to be more masterful of it rather than throwing a lot of cold, bitter herbs at it, trying to imitate, Western drugs.